First of all, thanks for the invite. Always a pleasure to talk about risk. Dr. Sawyer asked us to provide a few takeaway or take-home messages. Excuse me. And so that's what I did here on the next 3 slides. I don't want to appear preachy, but part of my background, I spent 15 years in the public sector where I got to attend a lot of public hearings and engage with some happy and not so happy stakeholders. And so I kind of used that background to inform this, some of the things I'm saying here. First and foremost, when you look when you engage with the lay public, and even in the published literature, risk is somehow divorced from decisions. And as Trina pointed out, it's not. I mean, you're going to make a decision today about something in the future. You're hoping that decision will lead to some good outcomes, some benefits will occur from it. But there's always a possibility that something bad could happen. Too often, the word risk gets connected only to the bad things. So if something's risky, or I wouldn't take a risk like that, or flying on the plane is risky, the perception is, or the feeling is, that risk is bad. Well, it's not. It can be, but it's both good and bad. Nobody makes a decision sort of outside of a psychotic environment where they expect nothing but bad to come from it. So that's an important thing to remember as you go forward and engage with people, to remind folks that it's about making decisions. Any decision can have good and bad. We're hoping to make a decision that has many, many good outcomes versus bad outcomes, but the probability of both exists. But it's not always bad. The other thing, as a second bullet on this slide, is that I spent most of my career calculating probabilities, that is, calculating the risk of good and bad. And sadly, it was only the last few years that I realized that when you come to make a decision with risk, it's partially a probability, like there's scientific determination or calculation, and a great deal of perception. Risk is a perceived situation as much as it is a calculated one. If you view it as a probability, then it comes down to a pretty straightforward statement. If we want to make a decision today, what are the probabilities of that decision having detrimental and beneficial outcomes at some point in the future? That's your risk, probability of a good and bad. And how confident are we in our estimates of these probabilities? Because as Trina pointed out in the earlier slides, all of our calculations have boundaries around them. They have uncertainty, called uncertainty, confidence intervals, prediction intervals, whatever. So I can say that I'm highly confident that I have a 50% chance of a good outcome and a 5% chance of a bad outcome. That's the calculation. That's the scientific aspect of it. And if you, depending on where you are in the literature, you'll get a lot of discussion of these calculations, and oftentimes the other part of risk, the perception part, is not discussed. So, Trina, if you could flip the slide for me, please. Good. So there's whole other side of this, and I believe you're going to have a webinar, a presentation by folks that do risk communication, risk perception as a business. So I'm not going to go into it very much here. Just to say that for most people, most lay people, a lot of scientific people, certainly a lot of non-scientific decision makers, how you view a decision in terms of whether it's going to be good and bad is driven by a whole set of heuristics. Availability bias, if I know, if it's a piece of information close at hand, that will guide my thoughts about what's risky or not. It's always about an individual. You can talk about, well, on average it'll be okay, or it only happens once in a million, or whatever. But if you go to a public meeting, you're going to have a room full of individuals, all of whom look at risk from their personal perspective. Another important feature, if it's voluntary, that's one thing. If it's not voluntary, that's a whole other thing. And familiarity is very important. You know, some of the earliest work in this perception made it really clear that to the extent that people understood or knew about what you were talking about, they were more willing to discuss it or entertain it. But as it got more and more esoteric, more and more technically dense, less and less familiar, it became harder for them to accept. This all concatenates into the generalized term safe. Someone says it's safe. In narrow perspective, the risk is acceptable. You know, there may not be any numbers involved, maybe a quantitation, but they have perceived the situation, the decision to be made, with possible outcomes as safe. And based on experience with regulatory decision and policymakers, their constituencies, and frankly, everybody has a constituency, and stakeholders who may be part of that constituency or maybe a third party or fourth party aspect to it. Safe tends to drive the conversation. You have to be very careful that, well, we did a scientific calculation and we have these probabilities calculated, and we got it peer reviewed and it's published, and science thinks it's great. You're still going to have to engage on the concept of safe. What are people's perceptions of what you want to do, of the decision you want to make? I think that's the important point here, is that if you're going to drive or inform decisions with risk, you have to understand that risk is both scientific and perceptual. And lastly, on this slide at least, the experience has been, and maybe this is coming primarily from the chemical risk perspective, but when push comes to shove, if your decision or your technology has a possible bad outcome to humans, that will drive the conversation. Protecting small creatures or plants or whatever can easily take a back seat to the real or perceived threat to humans from a given decision. So the last slide, please, Trina. Let me on a happier note. We've come a long way in ecological risk assessment since the days of the Red Book or even the Silver Book. As Trina showed, we have Bayesian belief networks that are now the software is easily used and very available. It allows us to capture probabilities and relationships, the probability of those relationships in ways that weren't so easy to do before. There's a growing interest in weighted evidence analysis. Oftentimes, ecological situations don't come down to numbers very easily. There is obviously a very large literature on mathematical ecology, but some of the relationships and some of our ability to understand the cause and effect of those relationships is still better managed by a narrative than by a number, or by a combination of narrative and number. And weighted evidence, which is of increasing interest in the European community, is starting to come of age as a way of handling that. As Trina pointed out, ecosystem services and its relationship to risk and decision-making is growing. Some people view it perhaps as a little human-centric. What services can the ecosystem provide to us? But on the other hand, it does provide a way of connecting potential pluses and minuses of the ecosystem to human concerns, and it somehow makes the conversation easier when you're talking about decisions involving ecology. And then the whole world of decision analytics, the ability to talk about alternatives, talk about different units of measure or different ways of measuring things, weighting your results, putting it into a recalculatable system that has exploded over the years as well. So 3 things, and then there were 3 things that I came away with after reading through what literature there is on gene and gene drive technology and its potential pluses and minuses, it's not clear what exactly the adverse effect might be, if there even is one. And the mere presence of altered genes could be construed by some as indicative of adverse effects. That may be a leap. So I would ask folks better equipped than I am in this particular area to really think about. There are obviously benefits from gene drive technology, but what do you think would be a potential adverse effect? And you need to define that yourselves sooner than later, or someone will define it for you, and that might not be very fair to decision makers. Other things is if your technology is somehow self-limiting and it can't get loose in the environment, it can't go where it's not expected to go, the chance of the probability of unintended consequences is essentially near zero, that would be great. I understand there's a reversal technology. That's not what I mean. It sounds like a cleanup. It's like, oh, well, something got away from us and now we have to go fix it. It's a better conversation of getting away from you is a very low probability to start with. Same with indirect consequences. One of the challenges that ecological risk has had over the years just for chemicals is not just what might happen to plants or animals in the immediate vicinity of a chemical release, but what if it gets into an animal, doesn't kill it, and that animal goes someplace else and affects some other set of animals? What if we lose a whole population as a result of a chemical release? What effect would that have on the community structure? What effect would that have on ecosystem services and so on? So to the extent that indirect consequences aren't likely, in other words, this not only can this not escape, but it isn't losing a population that this technology is directed at would not affect other populations. Is another, again, that would be another aspect that would seem to make, that you need to consider to make the risk of detrimental outcomes, provide a better perspective on the risk of detrimental outcome. So that's it for me. I think we're right at 11:30 your time. Well, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Sawyer, and it's all good.